Good evening, everybody. It's my pleasure as Chancellor of JTS to welcome you all, especially those who have not been here before. I'm told that we have a group of students here from the Mayanot Yeshiva High School in Teaneck, New Jersey. Is that so? You're here? Yes, welcome. With the school's Director of Student Activities, Ms. Sarah Gordon. Whether you're here for the first time or a long-time visitor, you should know that right now we go through the ritual. Please silence your cell phones. So let me welcome you in a little bit more detail to this year's Gershon D. Cohen Memorial Lecture. The annual lecture was established by the Honorable Judge Howard M. Holtzman, who is Honorary Chairman of JTS Board of Trustees, as a tribute to the late Gershon Cohen, who served as JTS Chancellor from 1972 till 1986, and is widely recognized as having been one of the most brilliant historians of the Jewish people of his generation. I had the great delight over the last year of reading through a set of memos that Gershon Cohen exchanged with Rabbi Simon Greenberg, then the Vice Chancellor of the seminary, about the role that JTS should be playing in the State of Israel. Cohen wrote rather eloquently about the fact that for him, the Jewish people were one, the Jewish tradition were one, and differences in expression, differences in community organization, differences in the patterns of Jewish religious life should not be allowed for 1 second to disturb the unity of the Jewish people. Of course, we know that that's a wish more than a fact. For Cohen, it was an ardent wish, and he spent many long hours, partly through this series of memos with Greenberg, trying to reimagine the role that JTS could play in the State of Israel and the role that the State of Israel could play at JTS. I see tonight's talk as very much an expression, especially of the latter, and it's all the more meaningful that tonight's program, which we're excited to present to you, came about at the initiative of our two speakers, both of whom are teaching at JTS this semester, and wanted to try an experiment of actually having Israelis of different points of view civilly and with real patience and listening power address the issues that so divide the State of Israel and our people. Let me introduce them briefly to you and then chart out the course of the evening. Yossi Klein Halevi is visiting professor of Israel Studies at JTS this semester and a senior fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem. He is a contributing editor of The New Republic, writes for the op-ed pages of leading American newspapers, including the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. His powerful new book, which I am about 50 pages away from finishing, Like Dreamers, the story of the Israeli paratroopers who reunited Jerusalem and divided a nation, has been called, quote, the Israeli epic by former Ambassador Michael Oren, who just completed his term of serving as Israel's ambassador to the United States. Yossi is also author of At the Entrance of the Garden of Eden, A Jew's Search for God with Christians and Muslims in the Holy Land, and of Memoirs of a Jewish Extremist, which told the story of his teenage attachment to and subsequent disillusionment with Jewish militancy. He has been active in Middle East reconciliation work and serves as the chairman of Open House, an Arab-Israeli, Jewish-Israeli center in the town of Ramla, near Tel Aviv. A native of Brooklyn, son of a Holocaust survivor, Yossi Klein Halevi moved to Israel in 1982. David Senesh is an adjunct assistant professor of pastoral care at JTS this fall and a lecturer at Levinson College of Education in Tel Aviv. A clinical psychologist and a supervisor of psychotherapy, he conducts research in narratives of trauma and resilience, and in the field of restorative justice and conflict resolution. He's a member of various professional groups actively dedicated to human rights and to opposing occupation and the practice of torture in Israel. Born in Israel, Dr. Senesh was a prisoner of war during the 1973 Yom Kippur War, and he has the family distinction of being the nephew of the late Chana Senesh, whose mission in Europe during World War II made her a national hero of Israel and the Jewish people. Our program tonight will proceed as follows. We will first hear from Yossi Klein Halevi, who will speak for about 15 minutes or so, and then from Dr. David Senesh, who will speak for the same length of time. I'm telling you what the program is. Our speakers will then dialogue with each other and then answer audience questions as moderated by Rabbi Julia Andelman, JTS's Director of Community Engagement. If you'd like to pose a question to our speakers, we ask that you jot it down on the index cards you were given when you entered the auditorium. We'll be collecting the cards after the two presentations. Please join me in welcoming Yossi Klein Halevi and Dr. David Senesh.
Thank you, Chancellor, and excuse me, it's been a very long book tour. And thank you especially for the opportunity and the privilege of being here at JTS. Of the three books that you mentioned, this topic, the question of power and morality, brings me back to my first book, which dealt with growing up as a Jewish extremist in Brooklyn in the 1960s, the 1970s, in not just a survivor family, but a Hungarian survivor family, which makes our debate tonight very much of an internal Hungarian affair. And for me, growing up in my home, I was taught that the villain of the Shoah was Jewish powerlessness. The villain was not anti-Semitism. It wasn't the Nazis. That was an indifferent storm. There was nothing to expect from the anti-Semites, or as my father would put it, from the Goyim. And therefore, there was really no reason to dwell on that hatred. Instead, for my father, the question was really, how could we have allowed ourselves to become so defenseless? The heroes, for me growing up, my hero was actually your aunt, Hannah Senesh. The first book in Hebrew that I read, and this was in second grade, was a biography, a child's biography of Hannah Senesh. And the villain in my home was also conveniently a Hungarian Jew. And Rudolf Kastner, a name some of you may recognize, represented the Hungarian Jewish leadership during the Shoah, the leadership which in my father's telling was responsible for not preparing the Jews, for misleading the Jews in the 1940s. The response that I naturally gravitated to was to go to those groups that promised absolute power. In my family, there was no limit to the amount of power that the Jewish people needed to accumulate. There was no such thing as a negative consequence of power for the Jewish people. It was impossible. So the groups that I joined were successively Beitar, which was the most right-wing of the Zionist youth movements that I was able to find, until the Jewish Defense League came along, and then I switched allegiance. The nationalist poet, the great poet, Israeli poet, Uri Tzvi Greenberg, wrote a line which I remember reading as a teenager, and that for me became emblematic of as I saw it then, a healthy Jewish relationship to power. And the line goes as follows. This is a translation from the Hebrew. And when the Messiah comes, and nations shall beat their swords into plowshares, you will not, my son, not you. Let that sink in for a moment. It is the opposite of what is known in the liberal Jewish community as tikkun olam. So that is really, we're talking about now the 60s, the early 70s. Fast forward to 1982, when I moved to Israel at age 29. And one of the hard gifts of Jewish sovereignty, of Zionism, turned out to be learning about the complexity of power. And it turns out that power is not an entirely free gift. And this is something that my father could never have imagined, could not have experienced. And I gradually came to realize, as an Israeli, and as I became acculturated into Israeli society and learned about the dilemmas that we faced, that the gap between my generation's reality and my father's generation should have been measured by centuries and not by mere decades. What I learned was that we bring to Israel and the dilemmas of Israel the various wisdoms that we learned in our wanderings as a people. I served during the first Intifada in the Gaza refugee camps. I was drafted in the late 1980s at the height of the first Intifada. And I became friends with two fellow reservists, both, as it turns out, African Jews, one from South Africa and one from Ethiopia. And when we patrolled the Palestinian refugee camps, I noticed that my South African friend, Wolfie, was becoming progressively more inward and depressed. And for him, this was the experience of Soweto. And this is not why he had come to Israel. This is not why he had come home. For my Ethiopian friend Shimon, there was absolutely no moral qualms. He had just come a few years earlier from a Sudanese refugee camp where he had to hide his Jewish identity. He had been wounded by a Sudanese soldier who suspected that he was Jewish. He had crushed his foot. Shimon and the other Ethiopian Jews in the camp were barefoot, and this Sudanese soldier had crushed Shimon's foot so that Shimon walked through our patrols limping, and our officer repeatedly wanted him to be discharged, and Shimon refused because he hadn't come home to Israel to have others defend him. And for him, Gaza posed no moral dilemma at all, because it was clear to Shimon that it was us or them. And when you looked at the graffiti on the walls of the Gaza refugee camps, swords dripping blood, piercing the map of the state of Israel, and graffiti that we could only imagine its content, Shimon said that their goal is to send me back to the refugee camps of Sudan, and this is our home, and this is our last stand. Two African Jews, two completely different relationships to power. What I learned as an American Jew growing up with American values in the 60s, first of all, I learned that I had those values, and that I hadn't only been a good Beitari and a JDLer, that I actually had absorbed the values of the 60s and of the more normative American Jewish community. And those values came very strongly in response to the experience of being an occupier of another people during the first Intifada. And I came out of that experience convinced, as many of my generation became convinced, that we need to do whatever we can to try to end the occupation of the Palestinians. And what I learned subsequently through the 1990s, culminating in the year 2000, the second Intifada, was that just as the left had been correct in its warnings about the dangers of occupation, the right had been correct in its warnings about the dangers of a delusional peace with a Palestinian national movement that does not accept their most basic legitimacy in any borders. And so I emerged as a generation of Israelis emerged from the two intifadas together as a centrist, a little bit left and a little bit right. Left on occupation, right on security and peace. Or put another way, a centrist believes two things about a Palestinian state. One is that it is an existential necessity for Israel, for all the reasons I think most of you know. The demographic threat, freeing us from the untenable choice between Israel as a Jewish state or Israel as a democratic state, our growing pariah status around the world. So that's one belief that a centrist has about a Palestinian state, that it is an existential necessity for us. The second is that a Palestinian state is potentially an existential threat. And it is an existential threat because when we look around our borders, we see one failed Arab state after another, and the prospect of creating one more failed Arab state on our most sensitive border, the border with our main population centers, with Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, Ben Gurion Airport, that prospect terrifies a centrist no less than the ongoing occupation. Put another way, as a centrist, I have two nightmares about a Palestinian state. One is that there won't be a Palestinian state, and you can fill out the rest. And the other is that there will be a Palestinian state. And I think that that's where most Israelis are today. One can conceive of the debate among Israelis, this left-right schism over the decades, which actually most centrists today have now internalized, so that the left-right debate is not happening between two rival camps any longer, but it's happening really within each of us. And that debate is between two kinds of Jews that we can call, one we can call a Purim Jew and the other a Pesach Jew. And a Purim Jew remembers that we live in a world of existential enemies, that we live in a world where genocide is possible, and we are commanded to remember what Amalek tried to do to us when we were defenseless in the desert. A Pesach Jew remembers that we were slaves in the land of Egypt, that we are forbidden to do unto others what was done to us. And so the command of a Purim Jew, the way a Purim Jew reads Jewish history and interprets it for our time, is do not be naive. A Jew is forbidden to be a fool. The way that a Pesach Jew interprets our dilemma is we are forbidden to be brutal. I fear most of all the politics of purity, a Jewish politics of purity that chooses one or the other, that would pretend that the only choices we have is either to be a Purim Jew or a Pesach Jew rather than a synthesis of both. The politics of purity results in the distortions that we see around us. On the one hand, a Noam Chomsky, and on the other hand, a Meir Kahane. A Noam Chomsky who believes it's all our fault, and a Meir Kahane who believes that we have no moral responsibility at all except to defend ourselves. Our dilemma, Israel's dilemma, is twofold. We are unique in two ways. One is that we are the only democracy in the world that is a long-term occupier of another people. The second dilemma is that we are the only country in the world, many of whose neighbors want to destroy it. And so that when we sit to have peace talks, what we are seeking is mere recognition of our right to exist, which in any other negotiation is the starting point, where both sides take each other's right to exist as a matter of course. Another way of looking at that is that Israel is at once Goliath and David. We are Goliath in relation to the Palestinians. We are David in relation to the region. And so an Israeli tends to view this conflict with a split screen, where on one side we are the overwhelming power, and on the other side we are under existential threat. It's not surprising that it's so difficult for us as a people to find the right balance in our relationship to power. First of all, we have very little experience for many centuries with power. And the conditions under which we returned to power were simply inconceivable. Moving from 1945 to 1948, and not just moving from Shoah to renewal, but moving from Shoah to perpetual siege and conflict. And so we are a powerful country that needs to appreciate its power, but we are also a country that is under existential threat, and we need to appreciate our predicament. How then to navigate this dilemma? I would suggest 4 parameters. The first is to be very careful about tampering with the mechanics of our hard-won Jewish power. That means several things. It means, first of all, deeply respecting and appreciating the Israeli army. It means not turning the handful of draft resistors in our midst into heroes. It means, in this country, being grateful for AIPAC and the hard-won Jewish political power in Washington. Point number 2, our relationship to the occupation needs to be on a basis of security and security alone. That means that settlements, from my point of view, are not just an obstacle, but are a fundamental flaw in our policy. And we need a settlement freeze across the board without withdrawing from the territories until we are reasonably certain that we will not place ourselves in existential threat. The model that comes to my mind is the withdrawal from Gaza, the unilateral withdrawal. And if we can't find, in the long term, a way of reaching a peace agreement with the Palestinian national movement, and I am close to despair about the chances of us finding Palestinian leaders who will be able to offer us our minimal conditions for withdrawal. In that case, we need to have a fallback position in which we would unilaterally withdraw to whatever security lines we would determine and pull out the settlers and keep as much of the army behind, which is what we did not do in Gaza. And the message there is that the only reason we would continue maintaining an occupation in any form is for security reasons alone. Point number 3, we need to constantly monitor ourselves, not be complacent, not allow the existential threats that confront us to allow us to become lax in our moral standards. And that means, for example, continuing to maintain roadblocks in the territories when necessary, but at the same time being grateful for those Israeli volunteers who stand at the roadblocks to make sure that our 18 and 19-year-old boys don't humiliate Palestinians. And the final point, and this I think for me is most important of all in terms of finding our balance between the needs of power and the needs of morality, to avoid a celebration of power on the one hand, and on the other hand, to avoid a squeamishness about power. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yossi. Thank you very much, everybody, for having me here in JTS and in this debate. I want to thank JTS that made this debate possible. It takes guts to embark on something that you do not know where it might lead. But in every sikui, every chance, we take some sikun, we take some risk. I think that debates, dialogues, mediation, transform what seems to be intractable conflicts into negotiable realities, into mentalized compromises of realities, ideologies, dreams, sometimes nightmares, and make them maybe into a reality. And I think this is true here, and it's true for friends and for foes alike. I met Yossi only recently, and within few moments, we felt we shared deep concern and compassion to Israel despite our marked differences. And they are marked indeed. I feel Yossi is a good a really good bar plukta, and talking with him does stir new ideas and creates new thoughts in me. So if we think about bar plukta and we think about peleg, that is like fresh water. So I think that I really enjoy and appreciate what you're doing for me. In this respect, our dispute is a machloket, but it is something that we share. אנחנו חולקים. And it can serve as a blueprint to what I think we should do with our friends and foes, to share our commonalities and share our differences too. Isn't it really what the Torah kula al regel achat is all about? In life, we have to compromise with others and with ourselves, trying to achieve the best we can, but work out some compromise. The sad news about Israel, and I think you would agree with me, that throughout Israel's short history, wars were always won. If one war will not be won, then I won't be standing, neither would Yossi. We say that we are dependent on each other. In Hebrew we say we are tluim ze beze, unless if that will not be the case, we'll be tluim ze betzad ze. Okay, we'll be hanged this one by the other. So we did win all the wars, but the sad news is that none of the war brought Israel any closer to its strategic objectives. Politically, it doesn't serve us. And maybe it shouldn't, because wars are not waged in order to achieve some interests. Years ago, I was invited to the Greater Miami Jewish Federation to lecture on my aunt, the late Hannah Senesh. And later we were invited to the home of one of the sponsors of that event. And as we were standing on the porch of his unbelievable apartment, overlooking the flickering lights of Miami shores, he described how Israel should handle the next war, how we, the royal we, should drive the Arabs to the sea, etc., etc. However, when he said that we should fight to the last soldier, I suggested that we trade posts. He could go fight Israel's next war, and I would run his Miami estates. That was the last time I heard of him. But I'm here, it's okay. What I'm trying to suggest here is that the delicate fabric of relationship between American and Israeli Jews, we need no advice how to run our wars. This is one thing we know how to do well. But rather, we do need you guys. We need your bold and sober views that come from the depth of our common Jewish core, combined with a touch of American-made values, such as liberty, to get us back on track where the Jewish state derailed. We seem to be running amok towards messianic goals that were not reflected before. And these may eventually lead us to a cul-de-sac, if not over the edge. Paradoxically, though, most Israelis nowadays, my best friends, feel that we never had it so good. We survived economic crisis in Europe, in the States. Arab countries are falling apart. They are too weak to attack us now, and we can do just anything our hearts delight. On the other hand, we are constantly being reminded by our leaders that Israel is under existential threat of being attacked either by knives or by missiles. Living in this dual reality justifies almost anything, and we end up doing things just because we can do them. When you ask people, why do you think Israel did something? They say, because Israel can do it. I refrain here to apply psychiatric labels to such conduct, to someone who has no boundaries and survives from one crisis to another. But some of my dear colleagues who sit here can do it. Let me just say that developmentally speaking, it is pathetic to see someone at 60 years of age, the state of Israel, acts out like a teenager. We need some parental guidance. And since the so-called abusive parent or superpower, that is the Soviet Union, is gone, we could expect to benefit from a better enlightened parenting, so that with your generous offerings and contributions, do not say no strings attached, but rather do set contingencies and conditions and take part in shaping Israel's future, history and future, and ease its way back to the family of nations. We once believed that Israel is the ultimate solution for the Jewish problem. Now we realize, and it is embarrassing, that it has become the problem of the Jewish people. Even Israelis do not feel the pride of presenting themselves as such. And few are even prevented from traveling in Europe because they can be arrested. So how did we manage to get to this point where the Hag is hanging over our head like a dark cloud? Rachel the poet once wrote, "רק על עצמי לספר ידעתי, I could only tell you about myself," which assumes a humble position of not knowing when embarking on the task of learning and researching the complex realities that surround us. Subjectivity does not constitute apologetic base to do that, but it is rather the active and explorative attempt to test our predispositions, prejudices, and assumptions. It is the only way to assert our humanity. Rephrasing Immanuel Levinas, it is through the words of the other can be Yossi, the other can be any one of you, and the other can be the Palestinian or the Egyptian. It is through the words of the other that we learn about ourselves and about the world, and through the face of the other that we gain proximity to justice. In the sense that we assume responsibility. In Hebrew, achrayut, acher. The word acher is embedded in achrayut. So in participating in the debate and with your active participation, I hope that new understanding and meaning will emerge so that a never-ending process of deconstructing and reconstructing of positions will lead to new understanding and may lead or construct new realities. I admit that I represent only myself and my experience, and the very tiny fraction of Israeli society. That gives me freedom to speak up. If there were too many like David's, then maybe I will control myself. But there's such a very tiny fraction of Israeli society. And yet, as our elders said, lo b'shamayim hi, meaning the dispute should be handled down here on earth, on the ground. And today's Beit HaMidrash, the words of the minority should be heard and respected. They should be heard benachat, because this is dat miut, this is the view of the minority, but it is not miut adat. That doesn't mean that it's less clever or smart or predictive than the majority. And we sure know from history where groupthink and mobthink have taken us at the worst of times and circumstances. Let me start by suggesting that right and left are merely concretization and simplification of otherwise abstract ideas. When Yossi will attempt to conquer the center, he would implicitly marginalize me to the extreme left. Alternately, when I would claim the center, I will push him to the right extremity. There is the phenomenon in social psychology, and a few social psychologists here, known as the false consensus, where even the extremists themselves believe that they represent the mainstream and definitely the right thing. So let me suggest here that the right is not necessarily right, nor is the consensual center. At this point, I will just say about myself that my heart is in the left, and that is right for me. That is the right place for me. So, in this brief preference, allow me to take you through a journey, personal journey, into sometimes conflicting and even incompatible components of my Israeli identity. You know, conflicts can be, as presented here, you would like to be left and right, but there are certain points that you cannot be this and that, and you have to make choices. And when it comes to your own identity or the extensions of your identity, this is very painful because you have to let go of parts of yourself. So if I put my Israeli identity with my Jewish experience and the way I see the human condition, I'm in trouble. When we put Jewish state and democratic state in one basket, it doesn't fit. It is true my ideas were shaped by my experiences as a descendant of the Senesh family who gained much visibility in Israeli public and media as a former combat soldier and a prisoner of war, and currently as a psychologist who was trained in North America and was involved in research on restorative processes with native traditions. So all that mix make up David here, and whatever the ideas that I hold are good for me or true for me. There is no external validity necessarily. From the First Nations of teaching, I learned to look at the interrelatedness of all things and assume personal responsibility, even the things that are not in my proximity. My experiences as an Israeli living in North America taught me to be both assertive and humble about my Jewish identity and how it feels to be a minority. This is something most Israelis have not experienced. And yet, while you are a minority, to be a part of the society at large. This is really an art. This is something that you will never learn by being a member of Israeli Jewish majority, which at times may breed arrogance and insensitivity, because as a rule, people in power do not wish to share the power with the less fortunate. By saying that, I refer to my own tendency to look at things from bottom up rather than from top down. I make myself aware of a post-colonial tendency within me to hold to power, to hold to privilege, to hold to status, and to try to control without being aware of it. Occupation and superiority might be first achieved by military force, and they were achieved that way. But then they are maintained through psychological, social, economical, and even cultural means, acculturation. This is an amazing thing in itself, to see how occupation can be held with no tanks and no rifles, seemingly. They are there. But there is something else that is in motion. In walking the streets of New York, therefore, I will first see the homeless and the beggars, and only then I will tilt my head up to the awe of skyscrapers, and yet know how vulnerable they are, and I will feel the horror and the pain when they collapse. I will not, due to time constraint, I will not elaborate here on the legacy of my aunt, Hannah Senesh, because I have learned also throughout the years that everyone can shape the story to fit his own agenda. I will refer at times to what personally I learned from her mission, her diary and her poems, and from the stories told about her and her family. They may shed light on how she might have defined as the soul of Israel, of being Jewish and of being Zionist, because for her it was a personal process. I will not say that what she might say now, because that would be kind of a counterfeit, like what would she have said if she has been here, standing here. But I can say what people, or what she said herself and wrote herself in the diary. Nor would I tell you more details about the war and imprisonment experiences through the that indefinitely shaped and molded my views. In the 1973 Yom Kippur War, I was an impressionable 19 years old, ready to go on Akedah. But I was deserted at that time by an arrogant and careless Israeli government. I was murdered by a hateful mob of Arabs, merciless indeed, but I was awarded the gift of life by my enemy. I resurrected from imprisonment and torture. I crossed the lines and survived. This is why I think that my views will never be whole and complete. They will always be fragmented and ambivalent, full of criticism and doubt. But I feel that this provides a unique point of view that I am obliged to voice. And last, I am most careful in not extrapolating from psychology for my profession and being a psychotherapist to society at large. I don't think it's completely kosher to do so. And I will not put Israel on the analyst couch. I think that by doing so, we extend our professionalism from an intra and intersubjective to the transsubjective in a manner that cannot be justified. I do believe, however, that actions talk louder than words, and that action can transform the heart, and the changes of the heart will follow the good deeds. אחרי המעשים ייטו הלבבות. I believe that things happen that way. So in sum, to sum it all, I would say that though we could not compromise, and we will never compromise Israel's security, we cannot go once wrong. We cannot lose one war. So we will not compromise that. But we do run at the same time a similar risk if we compromise on democracy, human rights, and the enlightenment. No walls or barriers, red, purple, green lines, whatever color, will not defend us against the internal disintegration and loss of our own core identity. Then Israel, by any size, by any color, by any form, will simply diffuse and mix with them into the Middle Eastern neighborhood and lose both its distinctiveness and distinctness. I think it was President Franklin who said that if we compromise liberty for security, we end up losing both. So there is no better place than here, in the land of the brave and the free, to help Israel reshuffle its priorities in line with what is both Jewish and human. Thank you.
Before we begin with my questions and our questions, I wanted to invite the two of you, Yossi and David, to dialogue a little bit with each other, to comment on each other's presentations and to pose any questions that you may have for each other.
Okay, I'll just say that to give some proportion to the closeness and differences between us two, is that in order to prepare myself for today's debate, I'm not used in debates, it's not my common practice. I contacted a few of my friends in different organizations, and I have one token Israeli right-wing extremist that he likes me only for the fact that we fought in the same war, so we are brothers in arms. That's the only chesed I have. And he believes that something in me is Tinok Shenishba, and he will save me and this and that. Okay. And I presented Yossi's name, and he Googled him and said, what do you want me to say? I wanted him to tell me all the pitfalls of the right wing so that I can attack Yossi, of course. And he said, what are you talking about left and right? You are both leftists, Yefei Nefesh, sitting here and just having a family conversation. This is not really the situation. And what I want to say is that beyond us, extending to the far right and to the far left, there are people there, okay, that hold very, very strong views. So when they look upon us, they see this as a friendly conversation. But things are very, very, very tough, okay? Within Israel, within the opinions and the ideas that are expressed or not expressed in our culture. So having said that, put some things in proportion, please.
Okay, David, you know, listening to you, it also occurred to me that we don't really have a fundamental disagreement. We have many disagreements, but I'm not sure we have a basic disagreement. And if your two starting points are, first of all, that Israel cannot lose a war, which means recognizing the existential dilemma that we're in, that's on the one hand, and on the other hand, that we cannot afford to compromise our basic freedoms and our being as a democratic society, then I think we share the same common ground. Now, where we disagree, and I think disagree strongly, is I suspect that we see the year 2000 in very different ways, and what happened in the year 2000. Because listening to you, you sound to me like I might have sounded in the 1990s, and the way many Israelis sounded in the 1990s. The guilt, I was a guilty Israeli after the first Intifada, and we were a very large part of the Israeli population. There were many guilty Israelis. The year 2000 largely cured us of our guilt, in the sense that the moral burden for the occupation shifted from Israel to the Palestinian leadership. And that's because Israel made not one, but two attempts in the year 2000 to end the occupation. We became the first country that I can think of in history to voluntarily offer shared sovereignty over our capital city. And it was not just rejected, but it was met with 4 years of suicide bombings. So the persistence of the occupation, a friend of mine who used to be active in Peace Now once put it to me in the following way. He said, the Palestinians will not allow us to end the occupation. And I supported the unilateral withdrawal from Gaza because I didn't want to take that as the definitive assessment of our situation. Today, I'm not so sure. So that's point number one. Point number two is listening to you speak about the conflict. You remind me of how my father viewed the non-Jewish world, which is, it is an irrelevant force. And the Arabs are irrelevant in this conflict, and all that matters is us. There's a commonality, I find, in today's Israel between those who still remain on the left, and you are really I won't say an extinct minority, but certainly very, very, very small. Much more amplified among American Jews, by the way. The Israelis who are on the left have far greater traction here than in Israeli society. And the settlers, because what both the surviving members of the peace movement and the settlers have in common is that they both believe that it's entirely up to us. If you will it, it is no dream. And we either need the will to continue building and claiming what is ours, or we need the will to make peace. And both the settlers and the peace camp agree that the conflict is really a one-sided conflict. It's pretty much up to us. In terms of how you read Israeli society, you and I must live in very different countries, because almost every Israeli that I know, including critical Israelis, are deeply proud of being Israeli, still. I would say even more so since the Second Intifada and all that we've been through in the last 13 years, and the fact that we still have maintained our basic humanity under extraordinary pressure, the kind of pressure that no other democratic society is under. I see a tremendous restraint among Israelis, and I find the accusation that you make and other Israelis on the left make about Israeli recklessness to itself be deeply reckless, because that has resonance here, and I'm not sure that you always understand, and I don't mean you personally, but the Israeli left always understands how that assessment of Israel is translated here, because you're understanding a certain context. Your given is that we're acting reckless, but we are facing existential threats. We're exaggerating in our response, but the threat is real. That is not what is understood by many people outside of Israel. So the phrase really, David, you can't possibly mean the problem of the Jewish people is the state of Israel. The problem for 1 million Russian immigrants, the problem is not the state of Israel. For the Ethiopian immigrants, for many Israelis who have no possibility of getting a green card, Israel is not the problem of the Jewish people. And I find that tone on the part of the Israeli left is a how can I put it delicately, is outrageous.
That was delicate.
that was delicate. And because I fear, David, and again, this isn't directed toward you personally, but it is directed toward your camp. I fear that part of your camp is falling out of love with Israel, falling out of love with the Zionist story and with the Jewish return home. And one last point, which is that one of the greatest threats that I feel exists today to Israeli democracy is that in growing numbers of the Israeli elite, whether in academia, in the media, elsewhere, who speak in the name of liberal values and speak in the name of democracy, are increasingly alienated from the most basic national ethos that most Israelis cherish. And so when an average Israeli reads Haaretz, which doesn't usually happen, but the sense that the Abirei HaDemokratia, how would you translate that? The defenders of democracy are so often those who express contempt for our national ethos. The message that's conveyed to mainstream Israel is that there is something fundamentally incompatible between your love of Israel as a Jewish state, between your values as a Zionist, and democracy. And so this growing alienation on the part of within the Israeli elite is itself a growing threat to Israeli democracy.
Okay. So I'll start by having a comment about Haaretz newspaper, since one of the writers from Haaretz will be still already visiting here. So I take it as an insult if you think that the average Israeli is not intelligent enough to read a good quality newspaper
not
like
intelligent
Haaretz.
enough. That's not the reason.
But if I will be serious, and with a touch of sadness, I would say, we're talking here about realities and dreams and nightmares. And when the people who built Israel came with the dreams, some people came to Palestine and others came here. They had dreams here and they had dreams over there. And I don't know about the dreams of people who came here to the Lower East Side, how much of the dreams they accomplished and they materialized and they came true. But I can say something about our fathers and mothers who came from Europe after the war, but they told us about their dreams. And I feel that something happens to me just the same, that what I'm going to tell my son and my daughter about my dreams when I was 19 years old, and then what happened to those dreams and what's happening now. Maybe I will cite one of the Chachamei Ador, and that was my son. And he's more intelligent than me, so luckily enough it's me here, not him. But he was then about 15 years old. We were driving quietly Yom Shishi in our car, just the two of us, and it was like twilight, Kedusha shel Shabbat and everything. And I turned to him, I don't know where it came from. Bit me, I don't know. And I asked him, Omer, tell me, do you love Israel? He was shocked. And then he took some time, almost got past Hedera, and then he said, I hear him say, you know what, Dad? I love the land of Israel, I don't like the state of Israel. And I said, thank you, you clarified something in my mind. You don't have to take it all. It's not the whole package. You take bits and you don't have to go through self-effacement and you cannot say anything critical because you are not in Israel and somebody will hear you and he's anti-Semite and he will use it. I think that we have to wash our dishes and our laundry. We have to do it. And many people, when something bad happens in Israel, then a terror attack, people will turn to me and say, you see, we told you. These are not human beings. They shouldn't be given any right. They should be under occupation. They don't deserve anything. That's when something bad happened to us. Of course, they will turn to me. When something bad happens to them, that the military did, the all generous and, how do you call it, occupation, that enlightened occupation, that something happens, then people say, yes, maybe it didn't have to happen, but it's really the fault of the journalists that they reported it. They shouldn't report it. It doesn't occur to them that maybe that thing shouldn't happen, and then there will be nothing to report about. So this is something about having dreams and having and reality. And I think that really reality is very complex, and there are many, many things involved. And we have to be on guard. What I wanted to say, that there are also choices, I just refer to something you said before, that we don't have to be either Pesach Jews or Purim Jews. I want to remind us all that we've been through the desert for some 40 years, and we stopped near Mount Sinai, and actually we didn't want to get the 10 Commandments, but it was enforced on us. Har kegigit, remember, that was enforced on us. So we go through that, and we have to remember that we have to take the 10 Commandments and apply them. And what we do by acts of commission and acts of omission in the West Bank, what's called the occupied Palestinian territories, is unbearable to any reasonable Jewish person or any person at all. And it has this, in this respect, it has nothing to do with the Palestinians. I'm not going to do this for them. And even if some of my best friends will say, yes, you are self-hater, and then they will say you are Arab lover. That goes probably together. I don't know if I'm an Arab lover because I don't know Arabs at all. There's almost complete segregation. I don't see them daily. So I don't love them or hate them for that purpose. This is something I wanted to say, and I will just add another thing. That actions are not, when it comes to security, I let the experts say what they have to say. Sometimes they don't say it, only after they resign from their position. Okay, but I trust their integrity. I don't do that with the politicians, with the people in the armed forces I do. So I leave security to them, and this is vis-a-vis, there is an enemy, and it has to be taken into account. But when it comes to our moral behavior, we have to look at the mirror, and we have to look at ourselves and not say, oh, if they're doing something like this, we'll do the same. We have to do what we think is right. So, and indeed, the years of terrorism, I say from 73, the surprise war, and then the years of terrorism when we were in the process of peace, either imagined peace or delusional peace, that was a major, major trauma, and I think that Israel is an ongoing post-traumatic society. And myself, as being myself a post-traumatic person, I can appreciate it, but I think that post-traumatic society doesn't see it this way. So what happens is that we think that post-trauma is the disease, it's not the cure. We don't have to accept this and say, if this is the situation, then we all the time have to be on guard, and whatever we do is self-justified. No, we have to see that we have a problem here, that we carry traumas from generations back, and then those years of terrorism do form a trauma, and we are in a post-traumatic and ongoing post-traumatic situation. We have to take this into account and try to have to face it, and not act from this, but rather face it. And this is something that is very important for me to say. And another thing is that not all the actions are actual things that you do. There are also actions of taking responsibility over things that happened even in 1948. And then taking responsibility for things that happened today and yesterday and tomorrow. Taking responsibility. It's a symbolic act of taking responsibility first. Also taking responsibility over the problem of the refugees. We have to do that. The Canadians did it with the First Nations. I think we have to do it. We have to do it for our own sake, for our own state of mind. And that doesn't say that we have to give everything back and we have to do everything that we're asked to do. But I think we have to take responsibility and deep inside to feel the pain of the other. I have to tell you, Yom HaAtzmaut was the day of my life. I mean, once a year we were so happy in the Ha'atzmaut. No longer, because there are other people in the state of Israel that mourn that very same day. It affects me. I do not feel their pain, I admit. I do not feel the pain of the 48 Palestinian Arabs in Israel. I do not feel the pain. They do not feel my pain. But it does upset me to celebrate and know that other people mourn and are in pain, it upsets me. So somehow the festivity for me lowered. Okay. I went a little bit in free association, so.
Right. All right, the dialogue has clearly begun. I want to include more people in the conversation, so thank you so much. I wanted to just start the questions by taking us, just stepping back a little bit. You both mentioned personal narrative in your remarks, and parenthetically, American Jews take each other to task all the time for criticizing Israel. Your children don't fight in the army. How dare you have any critique? Both of you, your children have served in the army, and I wanted to ask you about that because it was something that came up when we were speaking a few weeks back. You both mentioned how that element of your personal narrative, your children serving the IDF, had such a significant impact in ways that we may not expect on your views.
For one thing, it brought us very closer in the conversation we had about our kids in the army, because this is where fathers meet. So we have really fatherly connection here. But I guess we may differ. Please say what you...
Well, in terms of American Jewish criticism of Israel, if that's your question.
That's not really my question.
What is
More, because we've heard that argument before, that we're not supposed to critique because our children aren't in the army, but I'm sort of using that just as framing. Really, I want to hear from the perspective of people whose children have been in the army. How does it change you? What do you feel you can and can't say?
I need to respond to the first part, because I agree with David that American Jews not only have the right but the responsibility to criticize when necessary. But where I disagree with David, and here again I find the right and the left have this in common. When they speak to American Jewry, each side invites criticism from American Jews that reinforces their camp. That's the only legitimate form of criticism. And so during the Oslo years, the Israeli right actively reached out to supporters in America to actually lobby Congress against Oslo. That was legitimate because that was supporting Israel. And David wants you to criticize Israel and actively get involved and attach all kinds of conditions to your support, but only to, I imagine, those American Jews who support your position.
No, in general.
In general.
In general.
Okay. But that includes the Miami Jew who so upset you.
He does, and I'd still be upset.
Okay.
But I rather prefer that he will not practice checkbook Judaism, as we Israelis call it, and pay the check in order not to feel the pain, not to feel the guilt, not to feel the shame. He can feel and process it, and hopefully he will get over it, because this is not what you're supposed to feel. And from that position, to say what is on his mind and make very, very clear contingencies where he wants the monies to go. Look, you are in a better situation than I am. I pay my taxes like you do here. I have no say about where it goes, and I predict that about 70-80% of this goes to unworthy purposes. It doesn't go back to me, okay? But when you make a contribution, this is a sacred monies, okay? You are doing it from your heart. It comes from there. It's appreciated the way it is. You should give it a label, and you should make it high resolution where you want it to go. And it's possible today to do it. And do contribute to Israelis, not to Israel. There is a vast difference between Israelis and Israel, and every Israeli will tell you that. There is Israel, abstract, and there are Israelis, real flesh and blood.
I think that many American Jews in growing numbers are already there, and that's a trend that's been happening now for many years. But Julie, I have to answer your question honestly, because on the one hand, I feel at least in principle that criticism from American Jews is, as I say, isn't only permitted, but is a responsibility. On the other hand, I feel very differently during war. When my son was in war in Gaza, I was not happy with the statement from J Street that denounced the war. J Street in the last round of Gaza fighting was much more nuanced. I think they learned something from that first experience. But when our sons are at war, I emotionally, and again, this may not be rational and it's not consistent, but emotionally, I don't appreciate the criticism, or I'll perhaps temper that by saying it depends how the criticism is offered. And this in this last conflict about a year ago between the IDF and Hamas, J Street began by affirming Israel's right to defend itself, by expressing its solidarity with the people of Sderot. And then it said, and of course, we're concerned about the safety of Palestinian civilians in Gaza. That was a very different kind of statement. And so the question really is, how is the criticism couched? And is the premise family solidarity? If you're starting from that sense of a family is now in a state of emergency, we're with you in your state of emergency, and then, but we have certain concerns that we feel need to be expressed.
Let me just interject and say that solidarity is a nice word, even in Polish, but it has double-edged sword because it can also be turned against. And what I urge people is to be well informed and visit and go places. And I can take you places that even Israelis do not go. It's only 15 minutes drive from where they live. They won't go. And I think it's just interesting to go. Have any of you ever been under occupation? I know my parents, my forefathers were, so it's just out of curiosity to take the bus for 15 minutes and go, and then you can tell your grandchildren that you were in a place like this. I can make you a tourist guide for West Bank.
David, excuse me, do you really mean to compare the occupation that the Palestinians experienced to the occupation that your parents lived under?
But there is something about... No,
that is what you just said.
We don't compare Holocaust and other people's Holocausts. We don't compare suffering of one person with another's. Everything is for in itself. But there is something about taking control over other people, if it's in family, in community, in politics, and across the border, and you take control over the lives of other people. This is something that is, by all measures, terrible. People can be born into occupation and die there and have 40, 50 years of life, and still they do not know anything else. My wife was involved in taking some kids for a 20 minutes drive from West Bank to the beach. Kids that were 12, 14 years old, never seen the beach, the ocean. How can a child grow up without seeing an ocean when it's across from there? So I urge people to be informed. And one thing that I just want to mention is that sometimes we are in love with our own creation. Like many Americans may have a view of Israel, which is very, very nice. And it's really, it's possible to admire the power and the army and to take a picture on a tank and this and that. And to enjoy that Jews can be a majority and powerful, and that they have a sovereignty in a country. This is really very appealing. But I think that sometimes you are in love with something, but this is not the whole picture, not the true picture. And what happens, and this is known in psychology, that once you project on somebody for long enough, that person starts to behave that way. We have to provide this for you, okay? You want us strong, we'll be strong. You want us controlling, powerful, we'll be that way. You don't want us with doubt. You don't want us with self-criticism. You don't want other people from out of the community to hear what I'm saying here. So what I'm saying, we have to grow out of this, because this is a very, I would say, infantile position, that I would do things because you want to see me as an Israeli this way. So this is why I say, don't be in love with Israel, be in love with Israelis.
I want to make sure we have some time for questions from the audience. So here are two questions together that are a little similar. So one question is it possible for a long-term occupier, in your opinion, to do it correctly and to disengage correctly? And a related question is, what would justice look like from both the Israeli and Palestinian side, from your perspective? To
answer the first question, I don't know. I don't know if it is possible. At this point, I would say it is not possible. If we freeze frame to this moment, it is not possible for Israel to safely disengage from the occupation. And again, I come back, David, to the question that I raised earlier, which is, what do you think happened in the year 2000? And when I listen to you, I hear myself in the 1990s, and I hear many other Israelis, and you speak as if the year 2000 never happened, as if the unilateral withdrawal from Gaza never happened. And again, it's always on us, and then you say, well, we need to be mindful of our security, and if we lose one war, we've lost the country. And yet somehow you're not connecting the dots, and you're not taking responsibility. Here we talk about taking responsibility for the collapse of the peace process. As someone who is a man of the left, you're not taking responsibility for the failure of the peace process. And so that's one point. And the second question was, what would a just solution look like? My understanding of this conflict is that there are two peoples, each of whom can make a compelling claim based on its own narrative for why the totality of the land between the river and the sea belongs to them. That means that when David says occupied Palestinian territory, as an Israeli, I resist, rebel. Judea and Samaria, for me, is not occupied territory. In the same way that I accept when Palestinians tell me that Haifa and Jaffa belongs to them, my response is, you're right. From your point of view, it does belong to you. And from my point of view, Hebron belongs to me. Now that leaves us with one of two choices. We either continue the war indefinitely, each side staking its maximalist claim, or each side contracts its claim, not gives up its claim, at least in principle, but in practice does not exercise its claim to the totality of the land. Now, the only way that I can see peace happening conceptually is if we accept the fact that the Palestinians really have a legitimate claim to the entirety of the land. In the same way that I expect them to accept the fact that I also have a claim to the totality of the land, because that's the reality of this conflict. That's what the diplomats keep avoiding when they speak about a two-state conflict, as if this is somehow abstract. It isn't abstract. It is two peoples who claim the same piece of land. Amos Oz once said that there isn't a misunderstanding between us and the Palestinians. The problem with the conflict is that each side understands each other all too well. And therefore, I insist on my claim being on the table during negotiations, in the same way that I will respect the totality of the Palestinian claim being put on the table. The solution, the only just solution, is for each side to impose on itself an act of historic injustice. For me to lose Hebron, after winning Hebron under the most justified conditions in 1967, is an act of profound historic injustice. It is a kind of dismemberment. But I have to be willing to do that in order to accommodate the counterclaim. By the same token, it is only because I do have a claim to Hebron, and I'm willing to relinquish the implementation of that claim, that I have the right, the moral right, to demand of the Palestinians that they relinquish the implementation of their claim to Haifa. Otherwise, I'm asking them to give up something that belongs to them, but I'm not giving up anything that belongs to me. When the Israeli left says this is occupied Palestinian territory, the message is we have no claim there, not even in principle. And so there's a built-in asymmetry. Just from the point of view of negotiations, it's unwise, because the other side in the process makes no compunction about claiming the totality of this land. And that message is broadcast to us every day in multiple ways. So the solution, from my point of view, the just solution, is mutually imposed injustice.
Okay. You know, in my dreams, there will be, you know, somebody will come from the outside and enforce on both parties some kind of a solution that will be accepted by them because they have to, will be enforced on them, and that will be the end of it. That will be, I sign on this even now without knowing what the terms will be. But that will not happen because after 40, 50, 60 years, and then, you know, we were led to believe that the Russians are the bad guys, but the Russians are gone. I don't think anybody really is keen on ending this conflict. There are too many interests running around there. I call it biblical real estate and other stuff that is not really relevant to why we are there. And why are Israelis ready to go to war to die is not for any interest other than for surviving. And the way I see it, and I'm really very alarmed, and all it takes is to take a 5-hour tour to the West Bank or 5 hours tour to Jerusalem itself without leaving the municipal boundaries of Jerusalem, 5 hours trip, that can mix your mind even if you're an Israeli. And just to see the picture there, not to solve it, because there are very, very smart people who cannot solve. So who am I, a psychologist from Tel Aviv, that will solve the problem? But I can state my mind, and I can behave accordingly. I will not go to the West Bank. Even if there is a conference in psychology, I will not go, and I let them know that I don't come, and why. So this is my personal decision, and I do see occupation as the essence of what we are going through and how it goes back in our face into our society. So I think we owe ourselves the benefit of letting go of this evil. And the way I see it is that there is a conflict, and I don't know if in my lifetime there will be a solution to it, but even conflicts, and we know this from families, couples, communities, we have to control and not be controlled by the conflict. And if we make things worse, we are going to end up with no liberty and no security. We are going to end up with having a one state for two people. Now, this can be Professor Yuda Shinhav's dream, to have a one state of Arab and Israelis, Jews and Arabs, Muslims living together. This is paradise, but I don't want to be the first one to experiment this. I haven't seen this anywhere else, but I hope this will be Acharit Hayamim. But for most Israelis, including most of the left, this is a nightmare. And when I see the right-wing government going steadily in this direction, when they build settlements not for security, but in order to build and make the way into the West Bank, in the end we are going to end up with a majority of Arabs, Muslims, and the Jewish state. If it wants to be democratic, it won't be democratic or won't be Jewish. You can't have it both. You can't eat the cake and have it too. So I think that the two-state solution, 67, is really a major compromise for Jews, and it's a major compromise for Arabs. It's a major compromise for Arabs, because when you talk to them, you know they are giving up on their dreams, just as we are giving up our dreams. Now, I'll be very, very sincere. I don't give up on my dreams. I do not dream about Hebron and about Gaza. It's my nightmare. I'll be thankful the day it won't be there. We will not be there. We will not be there. That will be good for me. So I do not compromise. But I think that just like in life, if I will do anything that I want and I dream and I wish, I'll be behind bars. Just right this moment. So I have to control myself, and even I have the power and the ability to do it, that doesn't mean that I'll go and do it. It is true that politics is the art of the possible. But politics is not everything. There's also ethical and moral considerations that control and balance the game of powers.
Could I just say one point? That, David, I think you've just summed up why the left will never be trusted by the Israeli public to make peace. And when you compare Hebron to Gaza, Gaza is our shared nightmare. Hebron is my dream. Not to permanently rule Hebron, but Hebron is part of my inner dream life. And to give up Hebron is a nightmare for me, a nightmare that I'm willing to do. But the only way that we are going to reach, as I say, a symmetry, a certain symmetry in negotiations, is if Palestinian negotiators understand that the Israelis across the table from them love Hebron, and that giving up Hebron is a major concession. Giving up Hebron is not a concession for you.
Okay, we're going for debate now. Real blood.
Yes.
Wait. You say that I'm not empathic to ourselves, among us Jews that really love Hebron, and it's part of their being, right? I'm not empathic as left.
I didn't say that. I said
Okay,
that
no,
you,
I'm not.
But it doesn't, you don't feel that.
Okay, but I'll tell you where you are not empathic to me. Because when I'm telling you that I'm almost a moral refugee in my own country, I mean it, and it's much pain for me. I don't have the pain here in New York. I still see things. I care for this. It's painful what I see here sometimes, but it's not the same pain. It's very painful for me when I say that we are in the dark of times. In the dark of times. Now, most Israelis will say, we never had it so good. This is the dark of times. So this is my pain. And when most Israelis will say the same token, they will say, I oppose occupation. We have to let go. We'll give it all back. We'll give it all back easily. But they say it and they go about their business. I don't go about my business. I go to see what is the mental health situation under occupation there for kids. What's the legal system, the parallel legal system the Jewish judges and Jewish attorneys are doing there. The same ones that are the attorneys in Tel Aviv and Haifa, when they go over a green line or purple or red, they become different people. And they have different set of rules. So what is it? A Jewish rule? Universal rule? International rule? So, and when you look at the situation like this, you say, well, we can make it, we can take more, we can have it all, but is it worth it?
We need to bring things to a close, so let me, I'm sorry, I know we could go on for
going
hours.
here.
You can stay. So I just want to close with a question from Ezra, wherever you are. Maybe you can answer this in 2 minutes or less each. Can you offer an idea for a practical step of how we can, Ezra says, how we can get human love and cooperation to trump destructiveness?
I will say and rest my case. I promise not to. Okay. In the past 2-3 years, I've participated in few dialogue groups. I decided to I made a decision. I know it's easier for my wife, and most of the people in those left-wing human rights movements and professional groups are women. I think the reason, I'm not a sociologist, but I really feel in my guts that men cannot do it. Men have been socialized in Israel. Really, women do it, and they do it in all fronts. So I learned from them, and now we have an alternative memorial night before Yom Ha'atzmaut, and it took guts for me to remember all the memorial days and all my friends and everything, and go to the alternative one and stand there in pain, remembering both the Jewish and the Arab victims of the conflict, mainly from the terrorist acts. And who runs the show is actually families, Jewish and Palestinians, that lost somebody very close. This is a moment of love. And the moment of love is possible when you feel the pain of the other. And it can be a refugee, and it can be a Palestinian, and it can be a fellow Israeli. This is the moment of love. And it's possible. We can do it, and our counterparts can do it. And those enclaves, those encapsulated moments, will flourish, will bloom, and will take over. But it's a matter of time. And the other powers that want it all, they can want it from their Quran, and our guys want it from their biblical writings. It will give way in the end. Those moments will be more extended and will take over. I fully believe this. And there was nothing more Jewish that I did in the last year, I can assure you. Nothing more Jewish, not human, it's not to discuss, was that I was summoned to go down to the Negev, and it has nothing to do with Palestinians. It has to do with work refugees that cross the border from Egypt and put in jail against international law. It goes together with occupation and everything. The state of Israel puts against the international law people from Sudan and not from Eritrea, not Jewish people, of course. They put him behind bars. And it was so easy to go there and by doing psychological assessment, claim and prove and write a report that that person, every day that he's in jail, affects his well-being and his mental health, to get him free. And that was my Passover gift for myself. I closed a whole cycle. And it doesn't matter that he's not a Palestinian but a refugee. It's so easy to do those things. So I think that this will eventually happen. And those also the thing that I see from the other side, for example, that people will go to concentration camps in combined groups, Arabs and Palestinians and Jews, and will go through the concentration camps. They will feel our pain, we will feel their pain, we'll come to terms. The rest of it is business. It's business. You have to draw the line somewhere. If we don't do that, we either lose our Jewishness or lose our humanity. Each one has its own weight for each.
So I would also like to answer that question personally. And in the late 1990s, I went on a one-person journey into Islam and Christianity in Israel and the Palestinian areas. And the purpose of this journey was to, as a religious Jew, to test the possibility of whether Muslims, Christians, and Jews can share something of God's presence together in that land, and whether religion can be put to uses other than incitement. And it became the basis of a book that I published. And the book came out, in fact, it came out literally on September 11th, 2001. That was the publication date. But more personally,
this is not good for PR.
It is not. It is not. But
not here.
But more personally, it came out during the Second Intifada, and for me, in some sense, that was more relevant, because by the time that book came out, and it was a story of reaching out, and there were some very powerful experiences, the kinds of experiences David is speaking about, one-on-one, and also being welcomed into certain communities, even in a mosque in a Gaza refugee camp where I had been a soldier during the First Intifada. And when the book came out during the Second Intifada, it was very hard for me to claim the book anymore. People would tell me how moved they were by the book, and I would get defensive and even angry and say, well, what do you think the book is about? Do you think that all we need to do is be religious people together, we can dance like Sufis together, and that's it, and that's the end? Look what's happening every day in our streets. And that was the mode that I was in. And the reason that I'm saying this is because when people feel that their most basic security is under assault, you cannot reach out. You can't make peace. And one's most basic security operates on several levels. There's the physical threat, which we experienced most acutely in those years of the Second Intifada. But more generally, it's the assault on our legitimacy that we're experiencing since the Second Intifada, and which is only growing. And so, David, when you say that we need to take responsibility for 1948, I agree with you. The problem is that that's not happening in an isolated, in just between us and the Palestinians. There's a context. And the context is that we are being blamed for the totality of this conflict. And when well-intentioned Israelis, deeply moral Israelis, say we need to take responsibility for 1948, again, the way that is translated abroad, and I understand we need to take responsibility for ourselves, for our own actions, but you can't divorce that from the consequences of what this means for how Israel is being judged in the world today. And if I take responsibility for 1948, What that means is I am adding to the blame on Israel, and it is a one-way blame because there are no voices right now on the other side. And I know that there are people on the other side who feel this way, but they're not speaking out publicly. There are no public voices on the other side saying, we, the Palestinians, or we, the Arab world, also need to start taking responsibility for some of what's gone wrong in this conflict. When I speak to Palestinians, and I say, I'm ready to take responsibility, shared responsibility, the response is, no, this is your conflict. We're the victims. You're the Nazis. And I'm not ready to play the role of Nazi in this conflict. And so when I speak about personal security, I'm also speaking about psychological security. And that's why we need a measure of responsibility today in terms of how we speak about Israel, how much we're ready to take responsibility for what's gone wrong, and to see how that will impact on the very legitimacy of Israel.
Thank you so much to both of you for educating us about some real complexity, difficult issues, and modeling a civil dialogue around some really challenging conversation. I also want to thank Tom Kazan for organizing this event so beautifully. Yossi's new book, Like Dreamers, The Story of the Israeli Paratroopers Who Reunited Jerusalem and Divided a Nation, is available for purchase out in the lobby, and Yossi's happy to sign books, so we just need to let him exit swiftly. Thank you for coming. Thank you for your questions. Happy Hanukkah, happy Thanksgiving in advance. See you soon.
Thank you very much.